The airport buzzed with activity on an early autumn day. The constant announcements over the loudspeakers blended with the hurried footsteps of travelers rushing to their gates. Occasionally, bursts of laughter erupted from groups of passengers waiting together, but amidst the bustling crowd, one young girl stood silently, apart, as though she belonged to another world. Amara Wilson, a 17-year-old girl with warm brown skin and calm, steady eyes, waited patiently in line at the ticket counter. She wore a simple white button-down shirt, blue jeans, and a pair of worn but clean sneakers. In her hand, she held tightly onto a first-class plane ticket and a small black shoulder bag. Excitement mingled with nervousness in her mind. This was not just any flight, it was the start of a new chapter in her life. Amara had recently earned a scholarship to one of Los Angeles' most prestigious high schools. The first class ticket wasn't something she had bought for herself. It was a gift from the person she loved most, Aunt Mia, a token of encouragement and good luck. The line moved forward slowly until Amara finally stepped up to the ticket counter. Behind it stood a tall woman with neatly tied back hair and a professional, though cold, smile. The name badge pinned to her uniform read, Emily Carter. Good morning. Here's my ticket, Amara said softly, handing over her boarding pass and ID to Emily. Emily glanced briefly at Amara, her eyes scanning her from head to toe with a subtle but unmistakable look of judgment. The first-class ticket seemed to catch her off guard, her brow furrowing ever so slightly, before her polite smile returned. First class? Emily asked, her tone tinged with doubt. Yes, that's right, Amara replied, striving to keep her voice steady. Emily checked the ticket, glanced at the ID, then back at Amara. She nodded, but couldn't completely hide the hint of suspicion in her eyes. After a few moments, she handed the ticket back with a faint, almost mechanical smile. You can proceed to security screening. Have a pleasant flight. Amara thanked her, though a small knot of unease formed in her chest. She moved past the security checkpoint and headed toward the lounge, trying to convince herself that she was overthinking things. The first-class lounge at the airport was like nothing Amara had experienced before. Luxurious seating, drinks served at one's request, and soft ambient lighting created an atmosphere of comfort she wasn't accustomed to. She chose a seat by the window, placed her bag down, and sat upright, doing her best not to appear out of place. The other passengers in the lounge, mostly business professionals in tailored suits or affluent individuals engaged in lively conversations, seemed to pay her little attention. But Amara knew better. She could feel the occasional glances directed her way, fleeting but unmistakable, carrying a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Pulling a small book from her bag, she opened it to pass the time. Yet her eyes refused to stay on the words. A wave of loneliness and isolation suddenly washed over her, bringing memories of the modest home where she'd grown up and thoughts of her mother. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. You are my pride, my daughter. Always hold your head high. When the boarding announcement was made, Amara stood up, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked to the first-class gate. Emily was the one checking tickets at the gate, and as Amara approached, her eyes once again flickered with a hint of scrutiny. This time, however, she said nothing, simply scanning the ticket and gesturing for Amara to pass through. Entering the first-class cabin, Amara couldn't help but marvel at the luxurious surroundings. She took her seat by the window, a spacious and comfortable chair, placed her bag under her feet, and let out a soft sigh of relief. Just then, Emily approached with a tray of water. But instead of politely asking what Amara might prefer, Emily placed the glass of water on Amara's tray table with a movement that was sharper than necessary. Here's your water, Emily said curtly, without looking at Amara, before turning and walking away. Amara was slightly taken aback by Emily's demeanor, but chose not to say anything. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a notebook, and tried to focus on her notes. Inside, she reminded herself, don't let the little things get to you. Amara tried her best to ignore Emily's attitude, but the unease lingered in her mind. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath to regain her composure. Since she was young, she had learned to deal with judgmental looks and subtle remarks from people who doubted she deserved the opportunities she had earned. But this time, the tension felt heavier. It wasn't just a passing glance or a sly comment. It was a series of small but deliberate actions. Emily moved up and down the aisle, her smile suddenly bright and genuine when interacting with other passengers. A middle aged man in a tailored suit asked her to adjust the overhead compartment. Emily bent down carefully to move his bag, her voice unexpectedly soft and gentle. When she turned back, her gaze briefly landed on Amara before flitting away as if she didn't exist. Amara turned her attention to the window, where the endless blue sky stretched toward the horizon. She tried to let the melody of a song in her head soothe her growing discomfort, but Emily's gaze and her pointed tone lingered in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude. A bell chimed, signaling the beginning of meal service. Emily returned with a small cart, stopping at each row to ask the passengers for their preferences. When she reached Amara, however, she didn't bother asking. Instead, she placed a meal tray on the table with a dismissive air. "Excuse me, I don't eat meat. Could I have a vegetarian option?" Amara asked, keeping her voice calm. Emily paused, her eyes narrowing slightly before her lips curled into a half smirk that bordered on condescension. "That's why I asked earlier. You should have made it clear then." Amara blinked. "I don't recall you asking," she replied, her tone still polite, though her gaze sharpened as if to assert herself. Emily sighed, turned back to the cart, and retrieved a vegetarian meal. When she placed it down, her movement was forceful enough to make the tray clatter slightly. Amara nodded in thanks, but couldn't help noticing the curious glances from nearby passengers. A woman seated in the aisle across from Amara, who had been quietly observing the entire interaction, shook her head slightly at Emily's behavior. When her eyes met Amara's, she offered a gentle smile, as if to extend a silent gesture of empathy. Amara returned the smile, feeling a brief sense of relief. But it didn't last long. Emily's subtle, persistent actions continued to build. A quick adjustment of Amara's seat with visible impatience, curt reminders delivered with a dry tone, all of it unmistakably directed at her. A whisper from behind made Amara turn her head slightly. A casually dressed man was murmuring to his companion, his eyes darting between her and Emily. Though she couldn't catch every word, it was clear to Amara that they were commenting on the difference in how Emily treated her compared to others. Amara tightened her fists slightly before exhaling and letting them relax, a habit she had developed to stay composed. She recalled her mother's words, "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You already know your worth." The whispers in the cabin began to grow louder. A few passengers exchanged glances, their unease spreading like ripples in water. It wasn't just Amara. Others had noticed the unusual way Emily conducted herself. She leaned back in her seat, trying to focus on the notebook in her hands. But the words on the page blurred and danced, meaningless against the backdrop of her racing thoughts. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and resolved not to let this ruin her journey. What Emily didn't realize was that an unspoken wave was building in the cabin. Displeased glances and discreet murmurs from the passengers were increasingly directed at her. Everyone had seen what was happening, but no one spoke up. They seemed to be waiting, as if something bigger was about to unfold. And they were right. Amara sat still in her seat, trying to keep her eyes fixed on the notebook in her hands. The words on the pages felt like they had lost their meaning, dissolving under the weight of her emotional turmoil. She was no stranger to judgmental stares or veiled remarks. She had grown up learning to face forward and keep walking, no matter what. But the cold indifference in Emily's actions, the lack of courtesy in every small gesture, made her feel like a conspicuous target amidst the crowd. Emily, after placing a meal tray for another passenger, turned back toward the aisle, letting her gaze linger on Amara once more. Her eyes carried a silent message, as if to say Amara didn't belong here. But Amara kept her gaze downward, refusing to give anything away. Nearby, the older woman who had smiled at Amara earlier continued to observe quietly. Her eyes reflected clear disapproval, but she chose to remain silent. Emily carried on with her work, stopping occasionally to engage with other passengers. Her tone shifted dramatically. Her voice softened, her demeanor lightened. A man in a tailored suit sitting in the first row of the cabin requested assistance, and Emily immediately bent down with a warm smile. "I'll take care of that for you right away, sir," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness. From a distance, Amara couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in how Emily treated her compared to the other passengers. Those small, repeated slights slowly built a growing sense of discomfort within her, but Amara knew that showing anger now would only make her the center of more judgment. A passenger sitting behind her spoke up, his voice low enough not to draw attention but loud enough for Amara to hear. That girl. Is she the only one she's treating like this? His tone carried a hint of sarcasm. Clearly, the woman next to him replied, she's acting as if the girl doesn't belong here. Amara heard everything, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she put down her pen, her hand lightly gripping the edge of the table, feeling as though every pair of eyes in the cabin was now on her. The flight continued, the tension in the air spreading silently among the passengers. Emily either didn't notice or chose to ignore the fact that her behavior had become a focal point. As she walked down the aisle, she stopped near Amara's seat and glanced at the water bottle tucked under the seat pocket. You need to store your bottle properly, she said, her voice louder than necessary. Amara looked up, her gaze calm but firm. I thought I had done it correctly, she replied softly. Emily didn't respond. Simply shaking her head and shoving the bottle into a different position, her expression dripping with judgment. A few passengers nearby, no longer whispering, turned their heads openly toward the interaction. The older woman seated across the aisle leaned toward Amara. Don't let her bother you, she said in a low voice, loud enough for Amara to hear. You haven't done anything wrong. Amara nodded, her eyes reflecting gratitude. The woman's words, brief as they were, provided a small but meaningful reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere. Emily continued down the aisle, but her steps seemed stiffer now. The looks from the passengers were no longer just curious. They carried an unmistakable air of disapproval. The murmurs grew louder, spreading from one row to the next. Some passengers exchanged glances as if waiting for something to happen. Amara could sense it too, but she maintained her composure, sitting upright with her eyes focused on the window and her hands resting gently on her lap. Hold on to your dignity, no matter the circumstances, she recalled her mother's words, and this time she resolved to let them guide her through. Meanwhile, Emily remained oblivious to how far she had overstepped. With every step she took, the unspoken judgment from the passengers swelled like a rising tide, threatening to engulf her smugness, and the real storm had yet to come. Amara sat still in her seat, her gaze fixed on the serene blue sky stretching endlessly beyond the window. Inside, however, nothing felt calm. She could sense the tension in the cabin, the sidelong glances, the increasingly audible whispers. Every gesture, every action Emily made wasn't just directed at her anymore. It had now drawn the attention of nearly everyone around them. A passenger seated behind her muttered, his voice intentionally low but loud enough to carry. It's odd. She's only treating that young girl this way. The older woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze tracking Emily as she walked past. She sighed, shook her head, and turned toward Amara with a warm, reassuring smile. You've done nothing wrong, dear, she said gently, just loud enough for Amara to hear. Don't let her make you feel otherwise. Amara returned the smile, but stayed silent. She didn't want to escalate the situation or become the focal point of an even bigger scene. Yet her silence couldn't quell the growing tension that was now spreading across the cabin. Emily returned, this time empty-handed, her irritation plainly visible in the rigid set of her jaw and her brisk movements. As she passed by Amara's seat, she abruptly stopped, her eyes narrowing on the water bottle Amara had placed in the seat pocket. You need to store that properly, or it's going to fall out, she snapped, her voice unnecessarily loud. Amara looked up, her expression calm but firm. I believe it's stored correctly, she said quietly, her voice steady with an undertone of resolve. Emily frowned, choosing not to respond. Instead, she yanked the bottle from the pocket and shoved it back with exaggerated force. Then she turned and walked away without another word. Her actions drew pointed stares from several passengers nearby. A young man seated across the aisle leaned toward his companion, whispering heatedly, She definitely has something against that girl. A woman, row behind, couldn't hold back any longer. This is disgraceful, she said loudly, making no effort to hide her frustration. Her comment hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Emily hesitated for a moment, her shoulders stiffening, before striding down the aisle as if she hadn't heard. But it was clear that the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Passengers exchanged glances, some quietly observing, others murmuring their displeasure more openly. Amara kept her composure, her gaze steady as she turned back to the window. She knew this was no longer just about her. The quiet solidarity of the passengers around her filled her with a quiet strength. Her mother's words surfaced in her mind. Sometimes the greatest strength is in your dignity and patience. Unbeknownst to Emily, or even the rest of the cabin, a storm was quietly brewing. In first class, a passenger had just made an extraordinary realization. A figure they had only seen in headlines recently was aboard this very flight. A woman in a tailored coat leaned toward a flight attendant in first class, her voice filled with barely contained excitement. "Is that really him? I just read about him last week. I can't believe he's here." The whispers spread like wildfire through the first class cabin and began trickling down into business class. A young man seated a few rows from Amara pulled out his phone, typing a quick message before glancing at her, then back toward the front of the plane where the murmur of anticipation was growing louder. Emily still failed to notice anything unusual. She carried on with her duties, but the confidence in her steps now seemed shaky. The whispers, the constant stares directed at her, felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Amara placed her notebook down, glancing around the cabin. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense a shift in the air. It felt like the calm before a storm that Emily wouldn't be able to escape. Amara felt the atmosphere around her grow heavier, as if everything in the cabin was slowing down, bracing for something to erupt. She tried to focus on her notebook, but the peculiar stillness made it impossible to ignore. The faint whispers from the distance seemed to center on a name, someone she didn't recognize. In the first class cabin, a tall man with salt and pepper hair rose from his seat. He walked slowly down the aisle, exuding an air of authority without ostentation. His perfectly tailored suit accentuated his composed demeanor, drawing every gaze along the way. He said nothing, simply nodding politely as he passed by passengers, his sharp yet kind eyes meeting theirs briefly. When the man stopped at Amara's row, she looked up and held her breath. He was none other than her father, Victor Wilson, the renowned social activist and philanthropist. Placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, he gave her a warm, reassuring smile. "Are you all right, Amara?" Victor asked, his voice deep but comforting, as though he were trying to calm her amidst the crowd. "Yes, I'm fine," Amara replied, though her voice was quieter than usual. She didn't want anyone to hear the faint tremor in her tone. Victor looked at his daughter for a moment, then turned his calm yet piercing gaze toward Emily, who stood a few steps away. His eyes locked onto hers, and she froze. In that instant, the confidence and cold demeanor Emily had carried seemed to evaporate. She stood rooted to the spot, her eyes blinking rapidly as though unsure of her next move. A nearby passenger whispered, "That's him! I just read an article about him last week. I can't believe he's on this flight." Emily heard it all. She swallowed hard, feeling a wave of heat wash over her, but she didn't dare speak. She now realized who Victor Wilson was. And she also realized she had made a grave mistake. Victor leaned down and spoke softly to Amara. "You have nothing to worry about, sweetheart. I'll take care of it." Amara didn't reply. She knew her father, a man who always maintained composure and grace, even in the most challenging situations. But this time, she sensed a gravity in his voice. This wasn't just a minor incident. It was a reflection of the very prejudice and injustice Victor had spent his life fighting against. Emily tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She took a step forward, attempting to retain a shred of control over the situation. "Sir, I was only trying to ensure everything was done according to regulations." Her voice wavered, lacking its usual sharpness. Victor didn't interrupt her, but his gaze never left Emily's face. "What do you think went wrong here?" he asked, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable weight. Emily didn't respond immediately. She felt the dozens of eyes fixed on her, Amara's, the passengers, and most piercingly, Victor's. The space within the cabin suddenly felt unbearably confined. An older woman who had been watching the entire time finally broke the silence. "You know exactly what went wrong," she said, her tone steady yet cutting. The way you treated this young woman, we all saw it. Emily glanced around, feeling as though the world was collapsing around her. The passenger's words, now coming in rapid succession, pierced the self-image she had carefully constructed. But instead of feeling defensive, she felt hollow, as if all the certainty she'd held about herself had crumbled. Victor turned to Amara, placing a hand on her shoulder, silently conveying how proud he was of her composure throughout the ordeal. "You did well," he said, his voice filled with reassurance. Amara looked up, her eyes glinting with a newfound brightness as she met her father's gaze. For the first time, she felt as though everything was finally falling into place. Emily stood frozen, feeling as though the air in the cabin had grown even heavier. Victor's words weren't loud or angry, yet they carried a gravity she couldn't resist. She had never felt so small, so powerless. The stares of the passengers were like thousands of needles pricking her pride, each one emphasizing the mistakes she had made. Amara remained seated, but her eyes now held more than just calmness. They shone with a quiet confidence, not one she deliberately displayed, but one that naturally surfaced under the protective presence of her father. She didn't need to say anything more. Emily's actions, her judgments, had already been laid bare for everyone to see. Victor looked at Emily, his gaze devoid of anger or contempt, but filled with profound disappointment. "You know," he began, his voice deep and deliberate, "sometimes it's the smallest prejudices that cause the greatest harm, and sadly, you've just proven that to be true." Emily wanted to respond, to defend herself, but no words came out. Her throat felt dry, her legs as if they were glued to the floor. She wanted to walk away, to escape the moment, but she couldn't muster the strength to move. A passenger from a few rows back spoke up. "That's right. We've seen it all," he said, his tone neither angry nor accusatory, but firm and resolute. "You treated her differently than everyone else, just because she doesn't fit what you think she should be." These words were the final straw. A few passengers began nodding in agreement, and whispers quickly spread throughout the cabin. "That's right," another woman said. "We all saw it, and it wasn't fair." Emily felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. She turned her head, searching for support from anyone, but all she found were judgmental stares or disappointed shakes of the head. A colleague of hers, standing near the galley at the front of the cabin, looked at her with an expression of unease, as if silently acknowledging that she had gone too far. Victor said nothing more. He placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, signaling that the conversation was over. But the weight of his silence was more powerful than any words could have been. He turned and walked back toward the first-class cabin, leaving Emily standing there, alone and hollow amidst the crowd's quiet condemnation. Amara didn't watch her father leave. She sat upright, her gaze fixed on the window, but within her there was a strange feeling. It wasn't triumph or vindication. It was peace. Peace in knowing she didn't have to do anything to prove her worth, because her worth had already spoken for itself. Emily remained motionless, as if the space around her had frozen in time. A faint whisper arose from a corner of the cabin, but she couldn't make it out. The sounds around her had blurred into an indistinct hum. All she felt was a crushing weight on her chest, each breath becoming more difficult. Everything she had believed she controlled now seemed to have flipped on its head. A passenger seated in the first row set his coffee cup down gently. He looked directly at Emily, his gaze calm yet filled with judgment. "You thought no one noticed," he said, "but everyone did. The way you treated that young woman wasn't just unprofessional, it was shameful." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry and constricted. She struggled to find something to say, anything to defend herself, to explain, but no words came that could fill the oppressive silence. Meanwhile, Amara sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the window. No one noticed the relief glimmering in her gaze, a release she had been holding on to since the plane had taken off. She didn't need to say or do anything. All she needed to do was exist, and that alone was enough for the truth to reveal itself. Emily drew a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the serving tray. She stepped back, then quickly turned and retreated toward the galley. Once there, she leaned against the counter, closing her eyes for a few moments, trying to steady her rapid breathing. A colleague approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" the colleague asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Emily opened her eyes and looked at her coworker. I, I don't know, she whispered. I think I've done something wrong, something very wrong. Her colleague didn't respond immediately. She glanced out toward the business class cabin, where passengers were still murmuring, their gazes lingering in the direction Emily had just left. Mistakes aren't the problem, she said finally, her tone calm. The problem is what you do with them. Emily looked down at her trembling hands, knowing that from this moment on, there was no hiding from the truth. The prejudices she had once justified to herself had been laid bare, and they hadn't just hurt Amara, they had also hurt her, shattering the image she had always believed she represented. Meanwhile, Amara turned toward the older woman sitting across the aisle. The woman met her gaze, her eyes warm and encouraging. "You've done so well," she said softly, her voice gentle but resolute. "Just by being yourself, you've made them all reflect." Amara smiled and nodded lightly. "Thank you," she replied, her words carrying gratitude not only for the woman, but for everyone around her who had silently stood by her side. At the front of the plane, Victor returned to his seat in the first-class cabin. Quietly, he sat down, opened a small notebook, and jotted down a few lines. A first-class flight attendant approached him, bowing slightly out of respect. "Mr. Wilson, we deeply apologize if there was any discomfort during your flight," she said, her tone tinged with apprehension. Victor gave her a faint smile. "It's all right. I believe today's most important lesson wasn't meant for me." Emily returned to the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The passengers' words of judgment echoed in her mind, each one like a needle piercing the pride she had once thought unshakable. Her eyes locked onto the small mirror above the counter, where her reflection stared back at her, weary and confused. She had never felt so out of place in her own skin. How did it come to this, she wondered, but no answer came. Her actions, her words, and the gestures she thought were just instinctive had now been laid bare. They weren't just minor missteps. They were undeniable evidence of something far deeper she hadn't dared confront. She thought back to her early days in aviation, when her dream was to make every flight a pleasant and comfortable experience for passengers. But over the years, with the pressures of the job and the daily grind, Emily had unknowingly allowed prejudice to creep into her perception. And now it had betrayed her. Amara rested her head against the window, her eyes gazing out at the endless blue sky. But her thoughts weren't on the view. She thought of her mother, the woman who had always reminded her that the world was not an easy place, but was still full of opportunities for change. "You don't need to be perfect," her mother had once said, "but you need to be strong, strong enough to rise above what's unfair and grow from it." Those words had guided Amara throughout her life. But this time, she couldn't stop the creeping fatigue from settling into her mind. Why did everything always have to be so hard? Why, because of her skin color, her clothes, or a first-class ticket, did she always have to prove her worth? "Are you all right?" The gentle voice of the older woman across the aisle pulled Amara back to the present. She turned to meet the woman's concerned gaze. "I'm fine," Amara replied, though her smile couldn't quite mask her exhaustion. "I'm just thinking about a lot of things." The woman nodded, her eyes glowing with understanding. "Don't let things like this discourage you. You're a strong young woman, I can see that. And sometimes that strength is what changes everything." Amara smiled, this time more sincerely. The words weren't grand, but they were exactly what she needed to hear in that moment. In the first-class cabin, Victor sat still with his notebook in hand, but he wasn't writing. Instead, he stared into the distance, as if contemplating something profound. He understood the power of words and actions, and knew that this moment could serve as a lesson, not just for Emily, but also for Amara. Yet he also knew that real change couldn't be forced. It had to come from within the person facing their mistakes. Emily stood frozen in the cramped space of the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though she might collapse if she let go. The murmurs of passengers outside, the judgmental stares she could feel on her back, all seemed to press down on her like an invisible weight. She tried to trace the moment when everything had gone wrong, but the answer always led her back to herself, to the choices she had made. Emily's colleague, a younger flight attendant named Lauren, stepped into the galley, her eyes darting briefly in Emily's direction. Lauren had watched everything unfold from afar, sensing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere and knowing exactly where the focus lay. Even so, she didn't speak immediately. She poured a glass of water and set it on the counter in front of Emily. "You should drink this," Lauren said gently, though her eyes carried a stern undertone. "It seems like you need it." Emily glanced at Lauren, part of her grateful for the concern, but most of her feeling like she was being scrutinized. She picked up the glass but didn't drink. I think I think I've done something wrong," she whispered, her voice faltering under the weight of her own turmoil. Lauren nodded slowly, as if carefully choosing her words. "I'm not here to judge you," she said evenly, "but it's clear that you've hurt someone, and it's not just one person who noticed." Emily set the glass back down, her hands gripping it tightly as if it were a lifeline. "I didn't think things would get this bad. I didn't think." Her voice trailed off, as if the words had been swallowed by an overwhelming sense of guilt. Lauren leaned in slightly, her gaze sincere. "I understand the pressure of this job," she said, "but pressure isn't an excuse to act unfairly. If you feel like you've made a mistake, then the only thing you can do now is fix it." Emily didn't respond, but Lauren's words settled in her mind. Fix it. It was a concept she hadn't considered before. She had always prided herself on being efficient, keeping everything under control. But this time, everything had spiraled out of her control. Worse, she had been the one to let it happen. Outside the galley, Amara quietly observed the other passengers. Some were still whispering about what had happened, while others glanced at her with sympathetic eyes. But what mattered most to Amara wasn't the reactions of others, it was the feeling within herself. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel hatred. Instead, she felt relief. Relief that she hadn't let this injustice defeat her, and relief in knowing that she wasn't alone. The older woman across the aisle leaned forward, smiling warmly at Amara. "You're a strong young woman," she said, her voice quiet yet powerful. "You don't need to say anything because your actions have already spoken volumes." Amara looked at her, gratitude shining in her eyes. She didn't know this woman's name, but in this moment, she felt like a kind grandmother offering her a sense of protection. "Thank you," Amara whispered, her voice soft and tender. Up in the first-class cabin, Victor sat still in his seat, his gaze fixed on a blank page in his notebook. He didn't write, his hand merely holding the pen as if deep in thought. Over the years, Victor had fought against deeply ingrained societal prejudices, and he knew this was just one of thousands of similar situations. Yet, he also understood that instead of reacting with anger or condemnation, the best course of action was to let those involved realize the lesson for themselves. Another flight attendant approached Victor, bowing slightly out of respect. "Mr. Wilson, we apologize if there was any discomfort during today's flight," she said, her tone careful and reserved. Victor offered a faint smile, closing his notebook as he looked up at her. "It's all right," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "Sometimes uncomfortable moments are the most valuable lessons." The flight attendant bowed again before quietly walking away, but Victor's words lingered in her mind, prompting her to reflect on what had happened. Emily stood in the small galley, her hands still gripping the edge of the counter. Lauren's words echoed in her mind, reverberating like an undeniable truth that everything had spiraled out of her control. She wondered, if she could go back, would she be able to change anything? What could she possibly do to repair a mistake witnessed by the entire cabin? The weight of guilt grew heavier as she recalled Amara's gaze. Not angry, not hateful, but coldly composed, as if Emily didn't deserve any reaction at all. That hurt her more than any criticism could. Lauren stepped closer, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "If you want, I can help you," she said, her tone encouraging. "But the first thing you have to do is face yourself." Emily looked up, her eyes clouded with swirling thoughts. "Face myself?" she asked, her voice so faint it was barely audible. Lauren nodded. "You know what you did, Emily, and you know what needs to be done next. Start with an apology, not because of the pressure, but because you truly want to make things right." Emily stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the counter in front of her. Lauren was right. An apology was the first step, and perhaps the hardest thing she had ever had to do. Taking a deep breath, Emily clenched her hands tightly before slowly releasing them. She didn't know if anyone would forgive her, but she knew she had to try. In the business class cabin, Amara sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the bright sunlight streaming through the soft layers of white clouds outside the window. She tried to find peace in the tranquil view, but her thoughts kept circling back. She thought about Emily, about the way the flight attendant had treated her since the moment she boarded the plane. She couldn't help but wonder, why was it always like this? Why did she constantly have to endure judgment because of her skin color, her clothes, or anything else she couldn't change? A small voice in her mind reminded her of her mother's words. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Your worth is in who you are, not in how they see you. Amara closed her eyes, taking a deep breath in and slowly exhaling. She knew she couldn't change how people thought, but she could control how she reacted. She resolved that no matter what happened, she wouldn't let this injustice rob her of the dignity her mother had taught her to uphold. Emily stepped out of the galley, her footsteps slow and hesitant, as though each step was a struggle. She didn't dare look up, didn't dare meet the eyes of the passengers she knew were watching her, but she also knew she couldn't avoid this forever. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the row where Amara was seated. Amara felt Emily's presence before she spoke. She lifted her head, her gaze steady and unflinching. Emily stood there, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes filled with unease. Miss Wilson, Emily began, her voice trembling, I want to apologize. Amara remained silent, waiting. Emily continued, her voice gaining clarity as though she was trying to regain the confidence she had lost. I know that I treated you unfairly, Emily said, and I'm truly sorry for that. There's no excuse for my behavior. I was wrong, and I hope you can accept my apology. Amara looked at Emily for a moment, her expression revealing nothing. Then she nodded gently. I accept your apology, she said, her tone calm but firm. But what's more important is for you to ask yourself why this happened and figure out how to make sure it doesn't happen again. Emily nodded, relief and shame mixing in her expression. Thank you, she said quietly. I will. Victor watched from a distance, a faint smile forming on his lips. He knew that while Emily had apologized, the real lesson still lay ahead. But he also believed that with the courage to confront her mistakes, Emily would find a way to make amends. Amara settled back into her seat, her eyes returning to the window. But this time, she felt lighter. She didn't know if Emily would truly change, but she knew she had done everything she could to face this injustice with dignity. As the flight approached its final moments, the captain's announcement echoed through the cabin, signaling the plane's descent. In business class, the atmosphere grew quieter, but the lingering weight of earlier events hung in the air. Some passengers exchanged glances, a few whispered to each other, while Amara sat still, her gaze fixed on the window as the clouds gave way to the city below. Emily retreated to the galley once more, but this time, the feelings within her were different. The apology she had offered didn't erase what had happened, but it gave her a small sense that she had taken the first step toward making amends. Lauren stood at the corner of the galley, watching Emily with a calm expression. You did well, Lauren said, breaking the silence. Emily shook her head slightly. I'm not sure it's enough, but at least I tried. Lauren smiled but didn't say more. She understood that what Emily needed now wasn't criticism or judgment, but time to confront herself. As the plane descended, Amara stood, checked her bag, and adjusted her white shirt. She felt the gazes of some passengers nearby, but this time they weren't curious or judgmental. Instead, they carried a quiet respect. The older woman across the aisle smiled warmly at her, the same comforting smile she had offered earlier. You're a strong young woman, the woman said once more. Never forget that. Amara bowed her head in gratitude. I'll remember. When the plane landed, passengers stood one by one, retrieving their belongings and preparing to disembark. Emily stood by the door, smiling as she bid farewell to each passenger. This time, her smile wasn't mechanical, it was genuine, though tinged with hesitation. When Amara reached the door, she paused briefly, her gaze meeting Emily's directly. Thank you for your apology, Amara said, her voice soft yet clear. I hope you turn it into a lesson. Emily nodded silently, her eyes reflecting a quiet determination. Outside the airport, Amara wheeled her suitcase toward the exit, where Victor was already waiting. He smiled as soon as he saw her, opening his arms wide to embrace his daughter. You did very well, he said, his voice brimming with pride. I'm not sure I did enough, Amara replied, though her tone no longer carried the weariness it had before. Victor stepped back, placing his hands on her shoulders, his gaze steady and resolute. You don't need to do enough. All you need is to hold on to your dignity, and you've done that. The rest, let the world handle. Amara smiled, and for the first time since boarding the flight, she felt truly at ease. Emily left the airport a bit later, walking slowly through the exit, her eyes fixed on the ground ahead. Amara's words echoed in her mind. Turn it into a lesson. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt the need to change, not to please others, but to live authentically with herself. She pulled out her phone, opened her browser, and searched for a course on diversity and inclusion training. A small step, but it was all she could do for now. Somewhere, the passengers from that flight recounted the story they had witnessed: a young woman with quiet resolve and dignity, a father embodying calmness and understanding, and a flight attendant who learned a profound lesson from her mistakes. The story didn't spread as a scandal, but as a gentle reminder that through loud confrontations, but through the small yet meaningful actions of each individual. We hope this story has brought you many emotions. If it has touched you, please share it with others to spread its message further. Thank you, and see you in the next story.